Okay, so in regard to Vietnam, um, it was a former French colony, as I hope we all recall, and then Japan ended up taking power around World War One and after, and um, of course World War Two comes along. Japan finally loses, ends up surrendering, and when they lose World War Two, they end up losing their colonies, including Vietnam, and the French go back and say, you know what, it was our territory, we're taking it back, it's going to be our territory again. But Ho Chi Minh, as a representative for the Vietnamese, declares independence. That's a picture of him over here on the right. And what ends up happening is an 8-year anti-French war of resistance that Ho Chi Minh fights against the French for independence. By 1954, the United States ends up supporting this man named Ngo Dinh Diem, and he is a South Vietnamese Catholic. He is pro-America, pro-French, and anti-communist. So of course the United States is going to support him. This picture on the left is President Eisenhower, American President Eisenhower, and Diem in Vietnam. And a problem with this is that most South Vietnamese are Buddhist. And Diem is very, very unpopular because the Buddhists in Vietnam feel that they are being suppressed and that they are not able to freely express their religious beliefs and their practices, and this leads to some major challenges. This image I'll show you in a second is a Buddhist monk in Saigon, which is in the south part of Vietnam, and he is protesting against the repression of the Buddhist majority. And his protest is one of the most violent, with self-immolation. He ends up burning himself. I'm going to show you the image now. It is a horrifying thought for most people to self-sacrifice, period. But to self-sacrifice in this way, to burn themselves in a extraordinary show of self-control. He's probably been meditating and is in a high meditative state. I don't know very many people or anyone personally who could sit through being burned to death in such a peaceful manner. And again, he is protesting against the Catholic leader who is supported by the United States. Here's another image. So it didn't happen just once, it happened more than once, several times. And these are Buddhist monks, similar to a priest or a pastor in Christianity, who is fighting against the man, in a sense, by killing himself in a public manner that is clearly extraordinarily painful. And this has a big effect on a lot of people. So there was a huge fear that the communist threat was really very strong, very powerful. And we know this is in many ways true because Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese leader who was rebelling against Diem, who was supported by the United States, Ho Chi Minh was supported by the Viet Cong and the communists, and that includes Mao in China and Stalin in the Soviet Union. And a lot of people were really freaking out that the communist world was expanding at the expense of democracy and capitalism. And so there was this fear of this domino effect, quote unquote. And I really like this image. The face is Stalin's face. Oops. This face is Stalin's face over the octopus. And you can see here the Soviet hammer and sickle. That's the symbol of the communist world. And they're symbolized as an octopus with tentacles reaching across the globe, going into the world to influence and to cause damage against democracy and against capitalism. Okay. Okay. Here's just one more picture of, this time, a bear representing the Soviet Union and their attempt at controlling the world by spreading communism. And there's little Uncle Joe or Abraham Lincoln, or I don't know who that figure is, representing America. And then the question was, well, is the spread of the communism really real? Well, regarding the fear of the domino effect, many people thought that in reality Vietnam was too small of a country to upset the international balance of power. But as we just saw, I think many people thought it was very real. Was America's interference and efforts in Vietnam good or bad? Well, one, Americans were fighting against guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla, spelled this way, is not the animal, the monkey gorilla. It is an attempt at fighting by people who do not wear uniforms, who are not formally trained. It is a bunch of young men usually, but also in this case, young children and women and elderly people who are told to combat the enemy. And when you're in Vietnam, you definitely can tell who an American is, because Americans look very different. But could Americans tell who their enemies were? No, because everyone was Vietnamese, and according to a white person's eye, all Vietnamese look the same. You can't tell if someone is pro-America or pro-communist, if they're Viet Cong, or if they're anti-communist. So the guerrilla warfare was a major, major problem, and this leads to major fear for U.S. troops who don't know if the person that they see is an enemy or a friend. This led to war crimes, and people were freaking out. It also led to violence and major drug use, because people are fighting in the jungles of Vietnam and don't know who their enemies are and don't know what their real goals are. And people started using and abusing hallucinogenic drugs that led to the jungle becoming more alive than it already was. And it led to major problems for soldiers, and even upon returning to the United States, soldiers had a lot of post-traumatic stress disorders, and drug use was rampant. And then there's what was called the defoliation campaign starting in 1968. The image that you see here is planes dropping chemicals on fields that are fertile, preventing them from growing crops that don't have basically poisons in them. And this was meant to starve out the enemy. One example of someone who believed that the Vietnam War was a bad thing, in 1967, Jonathan Schnell in the New Yorker said the United States is destroying the country that it is supposed to protect. And here are just a couple other interesting or sad facts. By 1973, the United States dropped 3 times as many explosives on North Vietnam than all bombs dropped on Europe, Asia, and Africa during World War II, including the 2 atomic bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That is quite a number to think about. 3 times as many explosives on North Vietnam than all bombs dropped during World War II, which is kind of unreal to think about. A couple clips I want to show you are a positive image of the Vietnam War and a negative image of the Vietnam War. We're going to start with Green Berets. This is a positive image produced in 1969, and the goal of this was obviously for the recording. It's very poor, but it's the best that we can do right now.
Cross-trained in intelligence and weapons. I speak Danish and have a working knowledge of Norwegian and English.
Detachment. Attach. Hut. Right. Two. Forward. Put. Muldoon, take over.
Yes, sir. I'm Master Sergeant Muldoon, and this is Sergeant McGee. Between us, we've had 3 tours of duty in South Vietnam, which makes us experts. So we've been ordered to volunteer to answer questions here for you today.
I'm Hume Parkinson. I happen to be a newspaper man. Since you've been in Vietnam, perhaps you can answer a question that many of our subscribers ask.
We'll try.
Why is the United States waging this ruthless war?
Foreign policy decisions are not made by the military. A soldier goes where he's told to go and fights whomever he's told to fight.
You agree with that, Sergeant McGee? That the Green Beret is just a military robot with no personal feelings?
Can I have your name, sir?
George Beckworth, Chronicle Herald.
Thank you, sir.
Sybil Sutton, Washington Sentinel. Will you please answer that question, Sergeant McGee? Do they press a button? Do you men do what you're told to do without any personal feelings or opinions?
We have feelings, Miss Sutton, and opinions. It's pretty hard not to form them out there.
Everyone knows the South Vietnamese are fighting and dying for their cause.
As soldiers, Miss Sutton, we can understand the killing of the military. But the extermination of the civilian leadership, the intentional murder and torture of innocent women and children.
Yes, I guess horrible things happen in war. But that doesn't mean to say they need us or even want us.
I'll try to answer that question for you. Let me put it in terms we all can understand. If this same thing happened here in the United States, every mayor in every city would be murdered. Every teacher that you ever known would be tortured and killed. Every professor you ever heard of. Every governor, every senator, every member of the House of Representatives and their combined families, all would be tortured and killed, and the like number kidnapped. But in spite of this, there's always some little fella out there willing to stand up and take the place of those who've been decimated. They need us, Miss Sutton, and they want us.
Sergeant, I'm Gladys Cooper, a housewife. It's strange that we've never read of this in the newspapers.
Well, that's newspapers for you, ma'am. You could fill volumes with what you don't read in them.
And sometimes very true, Sergeant. How do you know we should be fighting for this present government? They've had no free elections. They have no constitution. 6 months ago, a committee was appointed to form a constitution. Still no constitution.
The school I went to, Mr. Beckworth, taught us that the 13 colonies, with proper and educated leadership, all with the same goal in mind. After the Revolutionary War, took from 1776 to 1787, 11 years of peaceful effort before they came up with a paper that all 13 colonies would sign. Our present Constitution.
That's very good, Sergeant. But there are still a lot of people that believe that this is simply a war between the Vietnamese people. It's their war. Let's let them handle it.
Let them handle it, Mr. Beckworth. Captured weaponry from Red China, Chi-Com K-50, Chinese communists, SKS Soviet-made carbine, Russian communists, ammunition, Czechoslovakian-made, Czech communists. No, sir, Mr. Beckworth. It doesn't take a lead weight to fall on me or a hit from one of those weapons to recognize that what's involved here is communist domination of the world.
Dun dun dun!
Ladies and gentlemen, pardon us for giving a little more than a yes or no answer to your questions. Are there any more?